Welcome to the second episode of Inconclusive Thoughts. I am Martin Gak. I write Inconclusive Thoughts, and once a week I record this podcast in which I discuss current issues. I am a journalist in Berlin. I specialize in international politics, and I work mostly around European politics with its many tentacles and legs, including transatlantic issues, development issues, and security issues, which these days mostly are oriented to the Middle East and to Russia. This week, I talked to Julien Hoes, who is the editor of the French Dispatch here on Substack, a zine with a podcast included in it, in which Julien and different people discuss French politics in English and its geopolitical aspects, as well as European politics by and large. But he really is a man of many hats, so I invited him to talk about Europe, the recent attempt on the life of Trump, and what the current political climate means for the future of a European political discourse and the public sphere. So without further ado, I leave you with Julien and myself in conversation. So it's been a pretty wild ride the last couple of weeks in European politics, and then not only Orban goes to Hollywood, as they like to put it, but then immediately after that, Putin issues a threat against European capitals, and then all of a sudden Donald Trump gets shot. It's kind of hard to believe how much stuff in such a short period of time, especially in what they call the summer hole for media. Yet here we are. So perhaps you can begin by giving us a general sort of bird's eye view of where you think things stand, and especially how do you think that these things, particularly the last two, the Putin threat issue against Europe and Trump's shooting, kind of fit together?
So, I mean, it's really important to also understand the context about what's happening around us, where we've seen an erosion of the truth, for example. We've seen an erosion of reality from some people who tend to align with, people like Putin, people like Trump and all this kind of thing, and willingly spread misinformation and disinformation. And they do so in a way that while they always say it with a polite voice and they always say it with a nice way of doing it, a funny accent, blah, 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 they are actively eroding everything happening around us and contributing to an increasingly dangerous political situation. And this is the kind of situation where people like Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and the person who tried to kill Trump apparently benefit. So, for example, let's look at the Putin threats first, and we'll go to Trump. So Putin basically operates in a way where he has securitized things to an extreme, where everything he's trying to do is trying to bring everything to the brink. So every time someone supported Ukraine in any way, shape, or form, you would see Putin threatening to nuke people. You would see Putin threatening to invade countries. You would see Putin threatening retribution. And I think, to be honest, at this stage, we've heard so many threats from Putin that I don't really take them seriously. I mean, I think many world leaders actually take it seriously to an extent, but I mean, we even saw a few months back when France sent their howitzers to Ukraine, Putin threatened to nuke Paris, or I think it was his foreign minister. And you even had Emmanuel Macron on stage going, hey, you can threaten us all you want, but we have nukes too. So maybe dial it down and calm down a bit. It's almost passed off in a way that they're dealing with a petulant teenager, which, to be honest, at this stage is kind of what you have to do with these kind of people. Now, when you go down to the Trump situation, that's even more complex because it's very much there's several aspects there, and obviously we don't know what the motivations of the person are. And famously, the comparison is the guy who tried to kill Reagan, I think, because he wanted to impress Courtney Love or some actress. The problem that you have is that you have a president or a former president and potentially an elected president who has made violent rhetoric and dog whistling a feature of his communication strategy. In a similar way, doing a lot of securitization, making things seem existential at all times, etc., etc. And when you then look at the result of that, you have a society that's more violent, more unstable, and that's more willing to resort to violence. And you also have a situation where, gun control is not really there. You have a lot of people who feel that if they're aggrieved, they can behave in a violent way, in an aggressive way. And this all leads to these situations where, quite honestly, you have a reduced level of stability in a state and people want to engage in violence. And this is where you end up with things like shooting becoming more commonplace, to be quite honest.
I think the question to some degree is, I can sympathize with much of this diagnosis, I suppose, but what we also seem to be having is sort of a degree of polarization, a degree of heightened tension, as you put it, which it's not just sort of individual to particular polities or particular political operations, but it seems to actually cross-pollinate and produce both states of essentially heightened violence and heightened aggression in the political discourse and so on and so forth, but it also sort of feeds off of each other. So, in a sense, what we have all of a sudden is now Trump, who has essentially become a martyr for the cause. He survived. The iconography of the survival is really absolutely remarkable. And this really shifts the political conversation radically in Europe around NATO and Putin. In a sense, everybody was talking about, for the last couple of weeks, everybody was talking about, okay, well, how do we foolproof, bulletproof, really, Trump-proof NATO? And now I think it has become really a much more pressing issue, because if there was any hope that Biden would take power, which is still not impossible, obviously, but I think that we can say that the stocks for Biden have actually dropped pretty radically over the weekend with the shooting.
Yeah, 100%. And to be honest, because all of this comes together because if people tend to try to separate foreign affairs and domestic affairs into two separate camps, whereas in reality, geopolitics, for example, goes from a domestic level all the way to the global international stage. And Biden has been hit by, the erroneous accusations that he's planning to send American soldiers to Ukraine, for example, coming from Trump's allies. You've got the potential issues around dementia, which continue to be confused because you have accusations that are then disproven, but then they still exist in the public sphere, so they keep circulating. And on top of that, you have Trump's shooting, where he's, in my opinion, found himself one of the most historically powerful images in modern American history, where he's fist pumping in front of the American flag with blood covering his face and everything. There are so many confluence events that keep coming together, and it almost seems like Donald Trump is going to be elected. But we also need to keep in mind that Donald Trump is not guaranteed. There's still a couple of months. Don't get me wrong. I'm with you on the point that I think everything's leaning that way. But you're still seeing the odd poll that shows that Biden is actually ahead by 1 point or 2 points. And you also have to look at, for example, the polling for the potential replacements for Biden. So if they do choose to replace Biden and go for like a final stretch of a new candidate, I think I saw 2 polls where it showed that Kamala Harris would actually beat Biden by Trump by, I think, 2 points. So, there's a lot of things happening, but it's very like this, and this is why you always end up having people who say we need to reduce the temperature, we need to focus on reality, we can't keep disparaging what's happening around us, and we can't just keep pretending that people going on complete tangents when it comes to political reality is an okay thing. Because the issue is that you have to look at the way people view the world, how realistic it is, and how it's actually being engaged in by everybody. And if the temperature comes down, you get less violence, you get less aggressivity, you get less fake news, disinformation, misinformation, etc. The issue happens when you have people who basically act in bad faith and continue to do things and pretend that, they're acting in good faith when they're basically dismantling the system around them. And you also need to understand that, for example, the fact that Trump was shot and there are conspiracy theories pre-existing about them wanting to kill Trump, and then on top of that, you then have the conspiracy theories coming out that it was Joe Biden that tried to assassinate Donald Trump. It's all of this, all of the different changes, all the different spheres of information are actually combining to create a situation where, it benefits Trump, But also, it actually weakens Trump if Biden goes away, because the rhetorics are easily manipulated by anybody, even if these people are sticking to reality, for example.
I mean, we do have a completely wild communication landscape, right? I mean, we live in a communication environment which it is really, the crazies in the market have taken over the newspapers, the radio, and the television, right? I mean, and they have actually upped the antes in rather spectacular ways, because the problem that you have is that you're no longer, and I mean, I talk like somebody that comes from deep inside media, specifically around politics. I can say that broadcasting, in all the trappings of broadcasting, had been replaced by essentially hyper narrow casting on steroids, right? So, I mean, they can really convince you at 3 a.m. In front of your computer with the popcorn in one hand that, as a matter of fact, Kennedy was shot by, Martians. This I think it's absolutely clear. I think that what was very interesting about the reactions to Trump's shooting is that the conspiratorial force, I mean, as of right now, I'm really inclined to think that what we have seen is a lone sort of, a lone wolf that basically just did as many other lone wolves in American history, recent American history of violence. But it's very interesting to see how both sides of the public sphere in the U.S. have gone fully conspiratorial. Like on the one hand, you have the Biden. On the other hand, you have people saying that it was, Trump operating on himself, essentially a Bundestag fire kind of thing.
Yeah.
I wonder if this kind of thing does not point to essentially a public sphere that now is beyond repair, that what we have now is really just sort of rumor is reality, and that's what constitutes politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. Like, I think one of the first reactions that I got from posting the video of the Trump shooting and being like, this is absolutely unacceptable, etc., was, you don't know the real story. You're a fool. You don't know that actually it was Trump who did it. I think it was like something dumb, like it was Baron Trump who did a backflip and shot Trump in the head. Blah, 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 nonsense.
We can agree that even that would be absolutely unacceptable. So I think
exactly.
the claim that it's unacceptable, it's good enough.
Yeah, but you're right. There's a whole thing now where, we're so polarized and people are so locked in their silos that, you really have to ask yourself where a lot of this comes from, basically. Because, I mean, look, I'm one of the people, and most people who know me know that the biggest problem that I have with the world around us right now is that education is bottomed out. I mean, don't get me wrong, I didn't exactly go to a great school myself, but even then I knew enough, having witnessed 9/11 as a kid, that I wanted to understand what was happening. That led me to study a few other things like EU politics when I was in high school and that kind of shit. And, oops, sorry, bad words. But no, it's basically one of these things that's, I think education has basically, in a lot of ways, failed completely, with the help of a few of the crazier people. And in the US context, like these Tea Party people like Sarah Palin, because she was the first crank candidate, even if she was only for VP, that I picked up on. And you see a lot of these Marjorie Taylor Greene types, and even in France, a lot of the crazies from the Rassemblement National take from her playbook. They invert reality. They basically gaslight you live. We see a lot of them now in the Euro bubble who keep saying that, the ID have won, the far right is in power, blah, blah, blah. And it's, if you can count to 10, it's absolute nonsense. But, we're starting to see this inversion starting to leak into Brussels, for example. And it's dangerous because it means that education and the skill of critical thinking doesn't exist anymore in some circles.
We might have actually a much deeper problem, right? Which is that we are being... essentially being dispossessed of facts, right?
Yes.
I mean, the problem that we have is that it's not really just an issue of where is it that we converge in terms of understanding the facts. It's that the facts are actually being taken away. And to some degree, the thing that I find absolutely remarkable, I mean, and we can talk about education, but it's the fact that for any lie, you can actually digitally construct the fact in a way that is so completely, the verisimilitude is so strong that it becomes essentially non-debatable. And obviously, this is I think it sort of really sits very high in the list. of how is it that we get here. But I mean, I wonder if you can talk a bit about precisely that, this sort of the design or the construction of this kind of wedging or this kind of...
Yeah, I mean, there's a skill that I picked up on quite early that my standards are a bit too high to engage in it, but it's something that you see very often, especially with people on the far right and on the extremes of the left, is the sort of circularity of argument. So there's a lot of arguments that you see within Trumpism, Orbanism and everything, where it's circular arguments, where the most famous one is, just to take something off the top of my head, you'll have someone who starts arguing that, January 6th wasn't an insurrection because what they did was exactly the same as Black Lives Matters, which was governed by Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, who were trying to sabotage Donald Trump because they disliked democracy, and they disliked democracy because Donald Trump was going after Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, with a constructed thing, which is why that Donald Trump had to engage in January 6th, because this is how everything functions and you need to fight back because democracy, Black Lives, there's this circularity of arguments where basically people will try to drown you out in a circle of logic that makes zero sense when you actually take it one by one. And, someone may even put in deep state or Illuminati or something somewhere there. But they basically construct the circularity of arguments where they swamp you with so much information. They basically bury you in just words, and it's just word salad. And what they do is they do that because if you then fail to answer a single one of those questions, then they'll use that to attack every single other point that you make. And we've seen this, for example, in the French context with Jean-Luc Mélenchon does this, Marine Le Pen does this, Jordan Bardella does this when he's understood the question well enough to actually be able to respond, for example. We've seen the same thing in Spain with Vox. We've seen the same thing in Italy with Lega. We've seen it with Orban. Basically, it's a tactic that's used fairly frequently that people aren't necessarily aware of. And on top of that, you get the appeal to danger argument that happens quite often as well. Whereas, for example, EU federalism. Don't get me wrong. You got people who are anti or for, are in the middle. Good for them, whatever. If you look at how Viktor Orban responds to this, for example, or even outsiders respond to this, it's always a case of, they're trying to steal your freedom, or if they do this, then they're going to replace you with migrants from Turkey, or they're going to destroy your rights, or they're going to put you into concentration camps, and et cetera, There's always a series of tactics that are used because basically we need to understand that these people don't have morals. I mean, they don't have morals. They don't care about you. They don't care about what's happening around them. They care about what makes them feel good. And what makes them feel good in a lot of cases is that they're freedom fighters who really know how the world is functioning, how it is, and what they're doing. And you can tell someone is taking this kind of action because what they will do. And this is an example that's in my head because I was just watching a debate in the background on the whole Trump situation. You'll get people who will basically make arguments that, for example, something like January 6th was correct because of the fact that they were trying to steal the vote and all this kind of thing. And they will literally invent a whole alternative universe where they'll say the police let the protesters into the Capitol to entrap them. There was no violence. There was nothing, despite the fact that you have evidence that this all exists. And then what you end up seeing is you see this entirely constructed reality where, quite honestly, it's either that the person is brainwashed or suffering from some kind of psychosis, or they just don't respect you enough to actually talk to you about reality.
Well, there is also a very sort of a matter of political expediency, right? I mean, you were referring before to what now is becoming popularly known as the Gish Gallop, right? Just sort of going in and throwing around random facts, most of them, I mean, either out of context or just straight out lies. And I think that this is really quite visible. I do detect, especially in Europe, I think. I mean, the US story is a little bit different. I spent many, many, many years there. And I think that there is a certain amount of finesse and keen understanding, precisely because, I mean, it's not just Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin is probably, I agree with you. I think that this is the grandmother of all this madness. But I think that there is a tradition of that. I see in Europe much more sort of political incompetence in dealing with this kind of Gish gallops and this kind of questions. I actually wonder, I mean, if we can shift actually to Europe a bit. This is something that we did see. You were pointing to Bardella and you were pointing to Mélenchon, but I think across Europe, I mean, if you look at Fratelli Italia, if you look at the kind of things that Salvini has been, while he was in the up and up in 2019, 2020, the kind of things that he was funneling through the beast, through his digital channels, the kind of things that he was telling his people, essentially in vertical videos that were dispensed to his people as if there were messages from their own mothers. It seems that we have kind of the perfect storm, right? And what we have seen ultimately, and this to me is something that keeps coming back, it's no longer, it seems to me, a discussion about politics, because the foundational issue is now at stake. It's not really just republicanism, the question. It's really kind of, I mean, you actually said it yourself. There seems to be a question about our moral intuitions as a polity. Like the moral consensus seems to be breaking down, and we seem to be going back to conversations about the undesirable foreigner, the undesirable minority, the undesirable gay, so on and so forth. I mean, I can remain agnostic as to whether people like Corbyn are immoral. I have my own thoughts about that, but I still try to do journalism. But there is very clearly a question as to whether that political program is consistent with the moral intuitions. In France, I promise this will be the last word of a very long question, but I have the feeling that in France, in the second round, it really was the moral question that was on the ballot. Is this something you agree with?
I do, actually. And I mean, yes, we see a lot of gish galloping in Europe as well. And I love that word because it just sounds so absurd when you say it out. But, it is a tactic, and it is, I mean, I'm one of those people who I believe that, in the quest for decency, we've kind of gotten out of the habit of calling a spade and even trying to
and a bullshit.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that we've gotten too comfortable with, someone will come to you and say something like, Black people are more predisposed to crime and violence and blah, blah, blah. And that's it. And then, you basically, because they say it in a really polite way, people will not want to say, you are a racist asshole. How dare you? What people do was, actually, but the reality is the facts, blah, blah. And at that point, the person doesn't care because they just threw the fact out and blah, blah, blah. That's it. They don't want to talk about the socioeconomic facts. They don't talk about whatever. Same thing with, for example, refugees that came to Europe 7, 8, 9 years ago now. They don't want to talk about the fact that it actually increased GDP in Germany. It actually made Germany a stronger state, according to what we've seen, and that, the people who engage in violence since then are in a minority. And, statistically speaking, the people who engage in violence across cultures typically remains the same, whether it's a white French guy or a black German or someone from the Middle East or whatever. It's a societal thing. But when it comes to the general situation, we need to also look at the fact that, we can't be afraid to call people immoral if they're being immoral. Othering is a very simple thing to do. You see it in, for example, everybody has seen this happen in one of their friendship groups. One or two people have disliked the person, basically made everybody else dislike that person. And quite often it's very insidious, it's very bad, blah, blah. But we see this in our politics too, because people forget politics is a social act. Politics from top to bottom is an act of social engagement, social communication, all this kind of thing, which is where a lot of the more insidious things like, being respectful, trying to say things in a nice way, even if you're saying something that's actually quite awful, engaging in practices such as disinformation, misinformation, but saying it with a nice thing, with a nice joke alongside it or a smile on your face and this kind of thing. And this is something that penetrates quite widely in general when it comes to society. And this is why a lot of what we need to do as professionals, and this is why I think it's important that there are publications like EU Observer, that there's podcasts like this one, that there's the things that are happening across the board, which is why I launched the French Dispatch, for example, because I saw a lot of disinformation coming from places about France in the EU. And also why we also need to hold a lot of these agencies and these organizations and these news stations to account is because we need to actually be able to have the truth. And people will always say, but so the truth is subjective, blah, blah, blah. And, I come back to the typical thing. If we look outside of our windows, there's blue sky and the sun. If someone tells me that it's raining, I know they're full of shit, I'm not going to say, but actually maybe this is a valid opinion, blah, blah, blah. No, you're just making shit up.
Yeah, I think, I used to tell my students in philosophy that the perfect litmus test for this was cardiology. Everybody has their own opinion, but the moment you need a cardiologist, you really just go to the people you like best.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think that this is a very fair point. Do you have, perhaps this is too big a question, but let me throw you a big one to bring this to an end. Do you have a sense of what are the pressure points that we should be, besides the one you already mentioned, calling a spade, what are the pressure points that we should be pushing on in order to bring about sort of what clearly is a very needed correction in terms of the European political space and political discourse?
It's a complex one because there are some simple answers that, even as a French liberal who likes state intervention to some extent, there's some things that we could do that would be borderline problematic. Because, for example, a very simple thing is if someone's spreading lies and actively undermining political structures and, the state and society in general, one thing you could do is basically try and punish that. They've done that in France to some extent, where if you're actually spreading outright lies and disinformation, misinformation, you're effectively undermining society and damaging the structures of the state. So there's some things that you can do, even if it's quite a hard pill to swallow and it's something that's quite difficult.
But it's also, a way in which, you are giving fodder to those who say that, well, look,
exactly.
I have the truth, and now here I have the state trying, not to mention the fact that it's a direct attack on the supposedly sacrosanct, freedom of expression, etc.
Which is why it's problematic, because then you've got some slight political decisions on what is acceptable, and this is a problem in general. Even if we have this ready for hate speech and this kind of thing does get punished. Another thing we can do is we can start increasing the funding and education and really pushing hard on, a proper education policy that's going to teach people that, just because someone tells you something in a nice way doesn't mean it's correct. Maybe we're a bit ahead of what we can do right now, because, for example, what we can do is we can try to have sort of an EU education policy where every week you have, let's say, an hour or two of politics and philosophy and an hour on critical thinking and how to better digest information. But the problem that you then have with that is that you then have people who haven't gone through that, being the parents of the kids going through this, who may just be big fans of Elon Musk, and whenever Elon Musk says, hey, it's raining outside even if there's the sun, they're going to be like, oh, well, Elon Musk said it. It must be true because I own 3 Teslas and I also tweet a lot on Twitter behind an anonymous account, blah, blah, blah. There is one thing that could be done, actually. And this is something that is I think this would actually clash a bit with our culture in the West, but there's something that's done in Asia, particularly in places like Japan and Korea, where you have to link for example, if you play an online game or you engage in I think for social media as well, you have to link all of these things to your personal government issued ID. Because the way of dealing with certain things like, young children trying to play video games they shouldn't be able to play, people behaving poorly, because there were some issues where I think there were drug dealers who used to operate on World of Warcraft or something. So they basically started cracking down on that through this. Because I understand that there's an argument to be made about anonymous accounts on social media. There are some people who do that because they try to escape from dangerous situations where they had to go no contact with their families, they had to protect themselves from potentially overzealous or violent other people, and they have to try to hide, There's a way that we could do where even in those cases, you could potentially ask people to connect this to their government ID now that digital ID is becoming more popular. And that's why if there's people who are, for example, with all the death threats I've received in the years and years and years of all this kind of thing, that way, if someone does something like that, or they're spreading direct misinformation, or they're threatening politicians or individuals or blah, 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 then we could basically try to do something like that where we engage in a practice where people have to link their words to themselves, because there is a reality that people online feel safe because they're behind a fake picture and a fake name.
Yeah, I mean, I can see this. What I find interesting about the position you present, which I think that we're all more or less grappling with the same thing. Those of us who are looking at politics, and particularly, I mean, this is not a problem that I think that most people in tyrannical countries have, right? The problem that we have here is essentially what kind of democratic body we have, right? Yeah. This is our basic problem. Do we have sufficiently educated citizens and so on? And what I find really quite interesting about both examples you presented is that, and you recognize it yourself, right? In some sense, it goes against our most fundamental democratic intuitions, right? Privacy, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the question of, who has the right to define what is true and who has a right to determine what is that we're allowed to express. And I think that this itself shows that, in a way, there is a battle, at least one battle. I don't want to say the democratic battle, but there seems to be a battle that we have already lost. Yeah.
And I do think that it is a democratic battle. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to be someone who says, someone on the far right who says that they want to totally limit immigration, even if I think it's wrong and I think it's a destructive policy. They are entitled to have that opinion. I'm happy if someone comes to me and says, look, like this is the example I always use. Like, I don't like communism, for example, but if someone literally appeared, descended from God himself, with a policy paper that was this big that says this is all of the objective evidence that is entirely correct, that can be completely corroborated, that communism is the best way of engaging in governance, and I read through it and it was true, it was proven, I would say, okay, cool, we all had it wrong, let's all be communists. If this is the best way to do things, cool, whatever. Same thing for, conservatives, socialists, whatever. I'm willing to listen to people if they have actual evidence behind it. The problem that I have, and this is why I say it's a democratic battle, and I say this as a European Republican, is that we have people who basically have mistaken their feelings and just random nonsense they concoct in their head for objective reality. And the problem is that quite often, and I've had this happen in several of my personal social circles, I've had this happen in professional circles, you will have people who will invent complete and utter nonsense. And then when you challenge them on anything and ask them to present evidence, or you present evidence of why they're wrong, they will ignore all that and then criticize you for being mean. And we need to, first of all, fix the education system, figure out a way of tying what people say to their privacy, but also teaching people that you can't just rewrite reality. You can't just make things up and run entirely on feelings. Like, it's because this is dangerous. Like, you've got people who literally believe that just because they feel something really, really, really strongly, like, there are aliens in government and Emmanuel Macron's a 7-foot-tall lizard who shoots fire out of his toenails or some nonsense. You've got people who will say, this is why I can't trust the government. This is why I vote Marine Le Pen. It's like, for example, you had a candidate who got called out on some pretty racist rhetoric in France. And the most crazy idea that I've ever heard. She goes, I'm not actually racist because one of my friends is Spanish. No, you're just racist and also a bit dumb. Like, and quite honestly, I think, and I'm going to say something that's a bit mean, but I think that in society we've become too accustomed to being polite to people who are actually destructive to themselves and everybody else. We've lost the ability in society, I think, of criticizing people for not having a clue about what they're talking about. Like, I would feel ashamed if I said something and it was completely and utterly wrong and it basically made me look like an idiot. Like, I would actually feel a deep fundamental shame internally. And I think this is something that we've lost as a society in general, because people are too comfortable making things up, to go on a bit of a tangent. And I think that we haven't gotten to the point where societally, when people do this, we don't call them out on it and we don't point them out on what's going on. And I mean, of course, if someone says something that's incorrect, you don't just go, hey, what the hell, stick your head in the toilet, whatever. What we should be saying is, okay, speak to them, try to explain to what's going on. And if they then refuse to listen to actual factual reality, then at that point, you need to say, okay, you're not being serious, you're not acting in good faith. And to be honest, you're being disrespectful to me and just about everybody else by lying straight to my face and trying to gaslight me.
Julian Hoes, thank you very much for joining us. It was great having you to pick your brain and discuss a bit of the more general aspects of where politics are going and why do we find ourselves in the place where we do. We hope to have you again on the show. So that was Inconclusive Thoughts for Monday, July the 15th. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Julian Hoes over violence in the aftermath of the shooting of former President Trump. And if you like the show, do consider subscribing to my Substack, Inconclusive Thoughts. And of course, because it's a listener and reader supported operation, then do consider donating or pledging to Inconclusive Thoughts. So in any case, we'll see you again next week. And until then, we hope you have a very nice week.